November thing.
Oh yeah, I am. Yeah.
I'm doing it as well. I've been doing it for a while.
Yeah, my Movember thing's just coming in. For all you people that want to donate to men's cancers, a very worthy cause.
Put something through on the bottom. You can put a banner on the bottom with a website.
It should really come with a warning. Please ignore David Mintz's amateur mustache.
That's not
that bad.
I really think, by the way, I really think you should put that over across the bottom if you want it. I'm sure there's enough people here that somebody's going
to. I will. And in the course of tonight's show.
While
yeah. Right, Rabbi. Good evening. How are you?
Baruch Hashem. Well, how are you?
Yeah, I am well.
We have something about bereavements. I've just come off a shiva, and I've had a funeral on Friday and a funeral today. So,
and I don't think really we can even sort of. There's been some major sort of news this weekend as well.
Absolutely.
And
the first one to speak about is Chief Rabbi Sachs, or Emeritus Chief Rabbi Sachs.
Absolutely.
I was going to put out a video.
So we've got a video of him there whilst we're talking.
I remember him walking back and forth in our shul just like that. He did that. He came from my induction, and he came once before that as well, a year before my induction. And at the time it was I had been in the shul for too short a time that they decided they weren't going to induct me after 3 months. So then inducted me about a year and 3 months, or a year and 4 months after I'd been rabbi already. It was like old news. But he did. I have it. Actually, I'll show you. I have it here. See if I can get it right. On my wall. And there's me and Rabbi Sachs on that picture. Russell actually made that. Here's Rabbi Sachs speaking in our shul from our pulpit, speaking to me.
Yeah.
There was myself and Rabbi Sachs having a bit of a hug at the end of the whole ceremony. It was really a very, very special. It was a very, very special occasion. So I actually have that hanging on my wall. I've had it since my induction. I've had that hanging on my wall. Maybe not at that spot, but it's been there for quite a while. And really, very influential. There's so many people in this community, and so many people across Anglo Jewry, and the outpouring of feeling for the loss of really one of the leaders of Anglo Jewry of our generation has not been lost on anyone.
Undoubtedly. And I think what was one of the most fantastic things about him was this universal appeal that he had. And if you ever wanted to choose a spokesperson for the Jewish people that you could pretty much send into any surrounding and any circumstances, it was Rabbi Sachs. He was an extremely eloquent and erudite speaker, writer. He was extremely well educated, both on secular matters and religious matters. He truly was. I mean, everybody that met him was touched by his gentleness. He was a real gentleman, but he had a very authoritative tone to it all. And I think he was respected by Jews and non-Jews alike.
Sorry about that. What was interesting about his authority was that with it came a humility. When you met him in person, he was quite a humble person. He was not, he was not someone, even though you'd think, I'm the chief rabbi of the UK, I'm the chief rabbi of 250,000 Jews. With that comes a certain amount of bravado, a certain amount of arrogance, and it really wasn't there. It was, I didn't find that, whilst you say, yes, he spoke with an authority, he really did. When you spoke to him privately, that didn't come through in the same way. He came across a lot more gentle and a lot more humble. And it was really impressive to see that sort of switch, that on the one hand, he was able to project this very confident, great persona out on the outside, and yet on a personal level, you realize that he was still a humble person inside.
And was he sort of an easy character to go to for advice on rabbinical matters?
So I never went to him advice on rabbinical matters, but that was not because of it was easy or hard. It's very difficult to get through to the chief rabbi at any point in time. And so that, for me, it's always been Rabbi Ginsburg, because he picks up the phone almost every time I call, and it's made life very, very easy for me. But I call him quite a bit less than I did early on in my career. Early on in my career, I must have called him once every couple of weeks just to get some feedback to figure out what should I do here, what should I do there. I did speak with Rabbi Sachs at times. But again, Rabbi Sachs for many years was chief rabbi, and being chief rabbi is a very, very different job. It's a very, very different calling. Yes, he was the Rav of Golders Green Synagogue for a time as well. But I think pulpit rabbonus and chief rabbonus, as I've seen from my father, there are two very, very different beasts, so to speak, if you want to call them that.
Well, it's truly a great loss, and one that is mourned not just by our community, but what's tremendous is the sort of amount of tributes that I've read from people outside of the Jewish community that had cause to either interact with Rabbi Sachs or had been lucky enough to catch one of his many. I think he used to do Thought for the Day on, if I'm not mistaken, on Radio 4.
Yeah.
And they were always very sort of wise and considered thoughts that he took great care to make them universal in their appeal.
Absolutely. And I find his books also, I think his books are also quite universal in their appeal. And, a book about extremism, not in God's name, or, a book about science and Torah. He didn't shy away from difficult conversations, and he didn't shy away from difficult topics, and he was willing to write about them in a way where people opened up his books and were really impressed by Jewish wisdom and about the fact that Jewish wisdom and scientific wisdom, or today's knowledge and today's morals, didn't need to be at odds with each other. He was able to take the two and to marry them up in a very, very beautiful way. And that was part of his appeal as a chief rabbi, not only for us, but for so many other people, because they felt we were dealing with somebody that actually spoke the language of our generation, rather than somebody who stood up and then was talking about something that was totally foreign to people.
Yeah. I was very lucky to hear, I mean, you can hear it actually, it's a podcast, but he spoke at the beginning of the outbreak of Corona. He'd always been quite a critic of some of the distractions, as he used to call it, of modern technology. But he held his hands up and admitted that in the era of Corona, where we're physically detached from one another, technology and social media sort of has come in to fill the gap. And it's interesting how he sort of lived to see it come full circle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, what we're doing right now is the offshoot of Corona. And quite honestly, if I think about it, I don't think, if we had this every single Sunday night in shul, I'd be talking to the same 5 people who come to shul to watch grass grow and paint dry. And yet, this way, because we have this and it's appealing to people and people can watch it from at home with their on their couch with a family in very simple surroundings, it's made it possible for us actually to get this much more actually global reach, because we have people from all around the world listening to this, haven't we?
Yeah, we have, from Israel, from America, I think from Africa at one point as well.
Tells me every week he listens. So shout out to Dr. Tepper from Canada. He's actually called me last week, 2 weeks ago, to see how I was doing, and especially also to see how Michael Goldstone was doing. It was very nice of him. And so I know he listens in, so a shout out to him as well in Canada and Montreal. Thank you.
We've got some memories of Rabbi Sachs coming in from Rodney. I had the honor to escort Rabbi Lord Sachs around Heathlands, and he was brilliant with the residents. So sad. Echoing everybody's feelings on that extremely sad news that we received yesterday evening as Shabbos came out. Rabbi, in Lahavdil, Elef Havdolas, there are a lot of other news that has been going on this weekend, particularly in the international press. If you to look at the election results that have come in from America, have you heard about this election at all?
I heard they've not come in. I heard there was an election, but no results have come in. And whatever results, those results, we're going to prove it. We're going to show them wrong. I think, you have to. I mean, on the one hand, I'll say I think he's being a sore loser. On the other hand, my mother told me that my auntie, who lives in New Jersey, received a ballot paper from my grandmother, who's been dead for 17 years. So there definitely is, and there definitely was potential for people to commit voter fraud. And some of the votes, I won't say all of the votes, I think it's wrong to say all the votes, but some of the votes were not genuine votes, and I'm sure that there's what to be said of it. But I think that the amounts of people that have voted against him, it sounds so overwhelming that I find it hard to believe that the voter fraud is as pervasive as he makes it out to be.
I think that there is an element of, I don't even want to call it voter fraud, because I think it's something that it's a term that he's started to use a lot to erode our democratic principles around the world. But I think that most elections have an element of fraud, of mistakes, of ballots that shouldn't be counted. But I think that they're so small, the instances of these, as to be statistically insignificant. And I think that's what's interesting in this case. I think this is a real, this would be a real exercise in how not to bow out gracefully, because he seems to be clinging on to power with every grip that he has.
Well, wouldn't you?
It
Wouldn't
depends.
you if you were president of the United States and stood a chance to remain? I don't think he has a chance to remain, but these states, the ones that are very close, if even one of them swings in his favor, he might have won the election. So he's fighting and thrashing with all he can. Although, again, as you said, it looks very, to me, it doesn't look very gentlemanlike the way he's behaving. But again, I don't think anybody has ever accused him of being a gentleman.
No, and I don't think that's the way he conducts himself in general. I know there's a lot of mixed feelings particularly amongst the Jewish community, as to whether or not he was a good or a divisive character. But that's a topic for another time. Tonight's topic is perhaps a little bit more sober. In fact, actually, Rabbi, you don't know this, but I got an email during the week, or a message during the week, from a concerned regular listener who thought that the topic that we'd chosen had been maybe a little bit too heavy, or maybe a little bit too sad in terms of the severity of the topic. But really, this week's Sedra that's coming up, Chayei Sarah, opens with quite a major death in terms of Sarah Imenu, our first matriarch. And that's the way that the Sedra opens up. It announces that Sarah had died, and it's sort of that segment. It very quickly segues along from the story of the Akedah straight into the death of Sarah, and we're taught mostly from midrashic sources that this is no accident. That one thing is very much connected to the other. Mm-hmm. I'll let you explain.
Okay, so that's it's an interesting point to start with. So the Midrashim say that when Avraham Avinu was on his way to the Akedah, the angel came to him, so that the Yetzer Hara came to him and says, "What are you doing when your wife finds out about what you're going to do?" Have you ever had that? Like, you're doing something and it's very silly, and somebody says to you, "If your wife ever finds out about this, you'll be in the doghouse. You're going to be in trouble." Pardon? What did you say?
I said it happens all the time.
Yeah, it can happen to the best of us. So Avraham is being told over here, if your wife ever finds out, this is your one and only child, you're throwing away your future, what are you doing? And he says, no, we're willing to do it anyway. And then what happens is the Malach HaMavis shows her this scene of Avraham Avinu about to slaughter his son, and she dies from the shock of it. Or that's what the Medrash says, and that's what the juxtaposition of the two come to do. And then Avraham Avinu comes home from the Akedah, and here is his next test, because this is a massive test, and we've had this test. Every one of us has had this test. Have you ever done something good, and from that good, something negative has happened? So it's actually interesting. I had it was March 2017, and I was going to America for the first time in 14 years. I was going to visit my brother who had a baby, and I was going for the bris. And my wife said, well, before you go, could you just, and I rushed off to Kosher Savers, and I got all the shopping. And then I had to stop by Andrew Barkley, because I had a whole bunch of money for him for our charity that we give to the people within the shul, and it's run through his official charities. He's very, very nice the way he does it. And so I pulled up right outside his house. I went over the curb, and suddenly here, flat as a pancake. My tire had gone. In the meantime, I got all my shopping from Kosher Savers in the back. I got to get to my I have a taxi coming to my house in 45 minutes, and I probably hadn't packed yet properly either. And at that point, you just look up at God and you say to him, now, you know what, forget it. Maybe I shouldn't have gone and shouldn't have brought in the money now. And when you have that feeling of like, forget it, I shouldn't have done this good deed, it gets rid of all the goodness that you wanted to do. If you then have regret, it gets rid of it. And so Avraham Avinu is being tested now in having lost Sarah. Will he regret what he did? Oh, I shouldn't have done this arcade. I shouldn't have gone through with it. The Sultan was right. I should have really just given in and not done it. So that's his next test. And then his next test beyond that is how he was going to treat Ephron and the people of the Bnei Chais in order to be able to civilly be able to get it without getting into an argument, without getting into a fight, and without losing his temper at them. So there's a real high order. He's not finished yet, Avraham Avinu. After the test of that cave, some of the Mefarshim say he still had quite a few things left to do that he had to get right. And this was one of them. And so he comes back and he sees his wife has died, and it is quite a shock for him. The fact of coming back and seeing that situation, and then right away having to deal with it. And I'll actually segue from that into something really important, and that is reading through this Sedra, and then I'll tell you the following story. Makes me think of the following story. So Avraham Avinu comes home. His wife has died, and now he needs to go through these extensive negotiations with Ephron and with the Bnei Chais to try to find a burial place for his wife. And I remember Rabbi Sofer. Any of you have ever met Rabbi Sofer? He works at the Beth Din, and he's the Rav of Beis Yisrael, and he's in charge of Misaskim. And he told me that this is the story that actually spawned Misaskim here in Manchester. He said he knocked on by Diane Westheim's house. He had to see him about something halachic, and Diane Westheim was making phone calls, and he's running around, and he said to him, what's going on? What's the problem? He says, well, my sister just died, and I'm just making the phone calls to arrange for the Shiva chairs and to arrange for this and to arrange for that. And he was really busy trying to take care of everything himself. And at that point, Rabbi Sofer said, well, isn't it a shame that when somebody has just had a bereavement, that they need to start making all these administrative phone calls? Shouldn't there be an organization that says, you know what? You've just lost someone. Let us take care of the chairs. Let us take care of the candle. Let us take care of making sure the Sidurim or the Sefer Torah makes it to your house. The hassle and the headache that could come with it, especially for somebody who's recently bereaved. Why are you running around and doing this? Why don't you just spend the time of sort of like relaxing, doing your own thing, taking in your loss, etc., etc.? And so when you see Avraham Avinu, what he needs to go through, and then you hear this story, and it was the impetus really to create this tremendous tzedakah that we have. I mean, I don't know anyone almost within Manchester that's not been touched by the Misaskim one way or another. They're just an absolutely phenomenal charity with people that will go out of their way day and night to do things for people that they don't know, that they've never heard of, maybe they'll never meet again. It's really something tremendously special. And it's there to help people in the time where they need that help most.
But in practical terms, the order with which Avram had to deal with these things was as the Chumash says. Basically, the Pasha reads that he came home and he eulogized his wife, and then he cried for her, and yes. It teaches us something interesting about the order of events and the way that we deal with things. Practically, that even to this day, and from these came over here, you can infer very different practices that we have, even in terms of where we sit in sitting low to the ground, because it says Avram then got up, and so it's obviously it's all inferred from these few pesukim, and really it doesn't give it an awful lot of time. But what is interesting is that you very quickly come out of that section straight into what is possibly one of the first real estate deals ever documented in history, where Avram has to then purchase the caves of Machpelah, which of course is where everybody continued to be buried in that lineage anyway over the years. So it's a phenomenal story of firsts, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'll speak about the first point that you made first, because I think that's a really interesting point about first saying the hesped and then first giving the eulogy and then crying. I don't know how many of you have had this, but I have been to funerals, and you find two types of people. Well, there are more than two, but in general, the main two types of people that I have found is either those who you get to the funeral, they're just an absolute mess. Some people have been to a funeral and they're just emotional the whole time, and people are holding them up and they're crying, and that's fine. That's okay. I've had people say to me the very strange sentence, Rabbi, I'm not going to speak by my father's funeral. I might not keep it together. I might not hold it together. And I think to myself, well, what a sad thing to say. If you're not going to cry at your father's funeral, when are you going to cry? And it's no shame or embarrassment. I think it's the other way around. That for somebody to refuse to speak by their parents' funeral because they would get emotional is very sad. It's interesting. We just had a funeral recently. Barbara Levy, Oleh Shalom, who passed away, and she's got a son Jamie who lives in America, and he was just able to come over. They were able to make all the different arrangements. Amazing what they did, and Kate, we're coming to that. Yeah, so we're coming to that in a minute. That's going to be the other type. So when he came over and he stood up to speak, he said, "Yeah, I'll say something." He stood up to speak, and he was about to start saying something, and he just burst into tears. And he almost said nothing. He literally, basically said nothing. He just said, "I'm so sorry. You're with Dad now. I hope all is going to be well for you. I'm so sorry we didn't have more time together." That's it. But in his few words that he said, he captured so much, especially because of the emotion that went into it. And everybody was sort of all right, trying to catch the breath and just trying to get back into things. Where I've heard people eulogize their parents for 10, 15 minutes and say absolutely nothing. And what's true is, so that's the one type of people that are very emotional, but the other type of people are very numb. And that's what Kate just mentioned, and it's very true. I've seen people and they say to me, it's just not sunken in yet, Rabbi. I'm not there yet. I don't really feel it yet. And that's not abnormal. That's something that happens to many, many people. And then only at a later point, so you have the lispa, the sorry, you can have the hesped, which can be said sometimes almost mechanically. It's almost weird sometimes to see the way people say, "Dad, we will all miss you. Rest in peace. Love you. All the best." And you're like, I couldn't get that sentence out if I was them. There was no way I would get that out just the way they said it. And they just say it with a stoic face and everything. But it's the numbness and the shock that they're going through that doesn't allow them to express that emotion. And so, lispod l'sara, that Avraham Avinu might have been numb from the shock as well. He comes back, and suddenly his wife has passed away. But with Kosa, maybe only at a later point was he able to deal with that grief and to deal with that pain and to actually show his physical pain through an emotional response of crying. So I think that's the first thing that I would say that's really interesting. And then when we get to, we can speak about buying the Machpelah cave. I think there's a lot of interesting things. Of course, as an estate engineer, you must find it extremely interesting to discuss the.
We'll talk about the whole transaction, but let's.
How many sellers have you ever met like Ephron? Don't worry, I'll pay for the searches. I'll pay for your solicitor. You can have it at a discount 20%. When it comes to, I didn't really mean that.
Well,
and I didn't really mean this.
Well, okay. To go into a bit more detail, Ephron actually offers Avram the land for free. Now, we reading this in 2020 with the benefit of 2020 vision that we now have, and hindsight, and wars, and the state of Israel, and everything else, and the anti-Semitism, and the accusations, and the anti-Zionism that is floating about. This episode is one that is always mentioned as a transaction that happened outright, that we were offered, that everyone was offered this particular piece of land for free. He then insisted on paying for it, and what was interesting was the price that came afterwards. So we have a guy that went from going from you can have this land for free, don't worry about it, to 400 pieces of 400 shekels worth of silver, which apparently, I mean, I'm reading into this. I think Rashi says it somewhere. It was an absolute fortune, massively overpaying for that piece of land.
On top of it, he wanted crisp bills. On top of it, he wanted crisp bills. He wanted good. He didn't want coins that had been used already. He asked for specially newly minted coins. So he literally went from one end to the other. But I think Avraham Avinu shows, and I know this might not be the right time to discuss this, but Avraham Avinu shows a very important thing. Anthony Jacobs asked a good question. Why did Avraham Avinu insist on paying? And I think it shows you a very important thing. In general, I think people say in life there's no such thing as something for free. You know, everything that comes free comes with some form of price tag attached to it. Whether it is a price tag on some kind of emotion or whether a price tag at a later point. So I'll give you the example. I know there's a bad example to give, and I know not everybody's like this, but I'll give you an example that I often think of. There are people that have a lot of help from their in-laws in whatever way, helping them to buy a house, helping them with their monthly costs. Not everybody's able to make ends meet, and in-laws or parents are often very helpful in helping out young couples. But what then ends up happening is oftentimes, we'll come back to that in a minute as well, okay? And what often happens is then it becomes almost awkward to say no to them. So family wants to go on holiday and you say, okay, we're all going to Israel on holiday. And you're like, well, we weren't really planning on going to Israel. We just wanted to have a local holiday here at a cottage somewhere in the middle of the Cotswolds or something. But they're like, yeah, but we've all decided we're going on holiday and you're coming with us. And at that point, because they pay for everything, you're in their pocket. You somehow have to go along whether you like it or not. Have you met people like that? I don't know if you know stories like that.
It's that old adage, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And all of these, particularly when it comes to family, they can come with strings attached. So even the most open-handed, warm-hearted gesture can very often end up later on down the line being spun in a completely different way. It creates a very difficult dynamic. Not as Kate says, not necessarily true, not always true.
Not always true, but in most cases. And that might not be true in one specific instance, but I think in the greater position, I found it to be more often than not to be true rather than not true. There's always some form of trade-off somewhere. There's going to be some, even if it's an emotional trade-off, like, somebody gives you all the help, you feel bad not helping your mother, not helping your father, not doing this, not doing that. How can I not help them if they've given me X, Y, and Z? It's interesting, even from the rabbinic perspective, Rabbi Portnoy actually tells a story. It's not my stories, I can tell it. It's Rabbi Portnoy's story, who said that he never took anything from any of his members because he said it creates a conflict of interest. And if any of his members wanted to give him like a backhander or something at one point or another, he said, no, I have a charity. You're very welcome to give it to my charity. I won't take anything. He said there was one time where one of his members said, I don't know, his member was downsizing a house. I can't remember exactly the exact story. And they had a spare piano. And he called up Rabbi Portnoy and he says, I know you like piano. Rabbi Portnoy plays piano beautifully. His son Mendy is an amazing virtuoso at the piano. Rabbi Portnoy himself is also very good. He just doesn't do it that often in public. But would you be doing me a favor? Would you like this piano? Take this piano off me, and you can have it. You can use it. And he said, fine. And he asked his wife. His wife said, yes, we really need it, and let's take it. So they took it. He said 2-3 weeks later, he was stuck in a very, very sticky situation with that specific individual, and the fact that he had taken the piano was now what I do. And so he said that sometimes it's not at that moment. It could be later down the line. But at one point, oftentimes you'll end up as rabbis, families, friends, whatever it is, as you said, in general, or usually there's no such thing as a free lunch. And it might not be right away, but there is always, or almost always, some form of comeback on that. So Avraham Avinu doesn't want that. He doesn't want to owe Ephron anything. And more importantly, as was mentioned before, when you get something free, then you don't have the same claim to it as when you get it and you paid for it. You say to somebody, is this yours? Yes, I paid for it with my own money. Sounds much, much better than, is this yours? Yes, I got it as a present. When you want to say to someone, I paid for this. I fair and square, I went to the shop, I took money out of my pocket, or I used my credit card, and I paid for this with my money, with my cash. That sounds, it's much more convincing than the other option. And therefore, Avraham Avinu insisted on paying for the Me'aras Machpelah so that it is his, and there is no question or no doubt that it could be his, or that he didn't owe anybody anything. He should owe Ephron. Well, I owe Ephron a debt of gratitude because he was going to sell to me. No. I paid for it. I paid fully. I paid the whole price that he asked for. I paid it in the best shkolim possible. I went out of my way beyond the shadow of any doubt to give whatever I could for this, and it's mine without any ifs, ands, or buts. Nothing to add. This is mine.
Well, this must be our treasurer's favorite pastor, because the first recorded instance of somebody paying their burial board fees. But it is actually, it's an important obligation that people have to make sure that you have somewhere that you're going to be able to bury your dead in practical terms. That then became, so just in terms of, to go back into the history of this, the significance, because this is quite, Hebron is quite some way away from where Avram and Sarah were originally living at the time. How Sarah actually ended up there is a different question altogether. But it's a special burial site, as Clive says, because Adam and Eve originally said have been buried there. I think later on, Moses was. Is that right? Did they not? I read somewhere that
Moses was never buried in Israel. He was never buried in Israel.
So then you've got basically then
Abraham and Sarah,
and then you had Yitzchak and then Yaakov.
Yaakov and Leah.
And so, and also, this is meant to be the place where the entrance to the Garden of Eden was once, right?
It could be. I don't know. I don't know. I've not been given the exact coordinates. I've not heard that. Sorry, your Wi-Fi is sort of, you're getting into Shrub's Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I think I've inherited this from Ian Creek.
Yeah, and the head of
you carry on.
And what I would say is, by the way, I think also when you mention over here with the burial board, and this is a really important point, Avraham Avinu, part of the reason Avraham Avinu ended up paying so much is because what we call in the property business, he was a motivated seller, or he was a motivated buyer in this instance, whatever you want to call it. Avraham Avinu wanted this, and his wife had passed away, and Avraham says, I want this. He says, you want it? This is what's going to cost. Don't have much of a choice. Right? And you have that, I know, in real estate, sometimes if you have somebody, I know with people that they want a specific piece of real estate, sometimes they end up spending an absolute fortune on it because they want that specific piece of real estate. And you know that whoever owns it knows, I can squeeze this guy for it. You want it? It'll cost an extra $100,000. Why? Because I said so. You don't want it? I'll sell it to somebody else. And you can squeeze it. And Avraham Avinu did get squeezed quite hard over here for the situation he was in. And the truth is, and this is the reason I'm saying this, when it comes to burial board, there are people that don't pay their burial board fees. And then they always say, yeah, you know what, when it comes to it, I'll take care of it. Or when it comes to it, I'll do whatever I have to do. And they never realize it might come to it a lot faster than they thought. And when that then happens, they got to cough up a lot of money. Suddenly, somebody turns around and says, oh, I need a grave. Well, it could have cost you only 80 pounds a year for the last X amount of years. Instead, one burial could be about, I think is it 10 grand now? I think they've upped it to about 10 grand. So in order to
roughly speaking, it's in that ballpark, yeah.
It's in that ballpark figure. So 10,000 pounds, and that's only for one, whereas here, if you're paying like, I don't know, 150 pounds, it's for the whole family to take care of it. And so it is a lot cheaper to be paying your burial fees. And for those who don't have burial fees, this is I've spoken to people both in the Haredi and in the non-Haredi sector, and in both instances, they've said to me that many young people do not have burial board, and they're playing with fire. It's the same that people have. You have life insurance, just in case, God forbid. As somebody once said to me, life insurance should be money thrown in the bin. Alibi. You know what? The last thing you want to do is to cash in on your life insurance. Okay?
Yeah.
But people have life insurance because just in case. This is another kind of insurance people should have, just in case, to be able to say, just in case chas v'shalom something happens, we are taken care of. And there's so many people that don't really have now the wherewithal or the ability to be able to pay for this, and they might get hit very, very strongly at a later date. So it's just an important appeal, I guess, to people who don't have burial board to make sure that you do have burial board. It's not a clever idea not to have anything to fall back upon. What do you say? Do you have any knowledge of where ordinary people were buried?
It's something that.
So I don't know. The answer, Rodney, is I don't know. I don't know what people did or didn't do. Sorry.
But I'd imagine to have a family sort of crypt in the way that this is, where all the family are buried in one place, was probably quite common in those days as well.
Yes, that's right.
The way that Avram deals with this, with literally no haggling, just to pay it and get on with it, and to do it with dignity, tells us a lot about the way that we should be handling the burial process. I just want to go back to something that we touched on earlier, because I think this is probably one of the secrets of the Jewish method of mourning. You talked about two different kinds of people. People that sometimes are very much overcome by grief, and some people who are still in shock. They're still absolutely shell-shocked by this major episode in their life. But there's something about the systematic structure of Jewish mourning. We have a set method of practices that we follow for 7 days, where literally you're not left alone for a minute almost. And you have to sort of go along with the flow of in normal cases. The COVID times are very, very different, but in normal cases you go along with the flow of Shiva. You almost are pushed from one place to another, and even if you're in this absolute shock and daze, it's the process takes care of itself, and it allows people on many different levels to cope with this huge life-changing episode and very emotional episode, because it has a system, it has a structure. You almost know, even if you don't know yourself what to expect, everybody else around you knows what they should be doing. I think this is one of the things that is, in my opinion, is amazing about the Jewish system of mourning.
Absolutely. I often think back, when we speak about this story, I think back to the story of Rick and Tina. For most of you probably who are on this chat will remember this. Some of you maybe who are not from our community or maybe newer to the community might not remember. But Rick had a daughter, a special needs daughter by the name of Tina. She lived upstairs with him and Nancy, and it was actually interesting the way it all worked out. I remember 2 weeks before, it was Johnny Carr was making bar mitzvah that Shabbos. We didn't have the fence yet around the shul. We didn't have an eruv yet. And Johnny Carr says to me, Rabbi, we'd like to learn something about the halachas of a Kohen, because him and Joshua were Kohanim. Are Kohanim, not just were, but are Kohanim. And so what happens when somebody dies in their vicinity? And we spoke about it a little bit. And I remember coming to shul on that morning of the bar mitzvah. It was one of my first bar mitzvahs still, because it was within still the first year of me being rabbi. And I meet Clive by the front door. And Clive Sayers at the time, not Clive Most Barkley. Clive Sayers, who was president, and he says, Rabbi, I don't know how to say this to you, but Tina's passed away. And it was a real shock, because she'd been fine. There was nothing. And obviously the police had to come to rule out whether there was any foul play. It was a really horrible situation. In the meantime, we have a corpse in the shul, and we have a bar mitzvah of Kohanim. So it was a really awkward situation. We dealt with the situation, etc. But I remember a few days later, Rick saying the following to me, and this is where when it struck me about the beauty of our system. Rick said, I'm really going to throw myself into my work now, and it'll distract me. I won't have to think about what's happened. And I think that this idea of distraction is a bad idea. It doesn't work. And I've spoken to many different people who have had struggles with their mental health. And a lot of people who have struggles with their mental health, a lot of the struggles come from the fact that rather than dealing with their grief or dealing with their pain, what they've done is they've taken that pain and said, oh, just forget it. And they shoved it down into a deep part of their consciousness. And they do that again and again and again. And at one point or another, whether it is anxiety, whether it is depression, whatever else it might be, there are all these different ways that it could show itself. It spills forth, and they need to go for therapy. And the therapy just says to them, you know what you've done? You've literally, it's like, I don't know, sometimes like you have something that has a filter that needs cleaning. So if you're driving a car and you need to clean the filters, you need to change your oil, and you don't change the oil, at one point or another, the engine might seize up because the oil's gone. And here's the same thing. What you've done is you've created a situation where you've constantly taken things and sort of swallowed it and not dealt with it. And we as human beings, by speaking about it, by reliving it, we actually are able to deal with it emotionally. And so the idea of having a shiva where people are dedicated to just sitting and talking about the loss, talking about their father, their mother, their spouse, their brother, their sister, chas v'shalom, their child. You know, it's a very cathartic experience. It's a very important experience for them. And I found that it's really, really important. Can I make a caveat? I know it's been going for a long, what I said, it was going on for a while. But coming back to what you said, almost not leaving them alone, I think there's a very important thing that I would say here, and that's the following, which I remember from when my wife sat Shiva. My wife sat Shiva, and the times I think of the Shiva, she was sitting Shiva in Beanstalk home because we didn't have the room at home for all the people, and my father-in-law had lived in Beanstalk home for the last few months of his life because he had dementia. And what happened was, she was supposed to make it back at 3. I think the times were like, 9 to 1, and then again 3 to 6. And she was very tired, and she says, I got to get back for 3. And I said, you know what, forget it. You get back at 4. It's not the end of the world. And she came at 4, and then she got all these messages. So-and-so came to see you, and so-and-so came to see you. And they were unhappy that they came to see you, and you weren't around. And you almost felt like, I said to my wife, it's the other way around. You know, yes, you've come to pay respect to the mourners, but you have to also allow the mourners, as we spoke about last week. If you show up by somebody who's ill and they're sleeping, don't wake them just because you've come to visit them. If you've come to the mourners and the mourners are feeling down or tired or whatever else it is, and they don't have the koyach to speak to you now, then that needs to be okay. That you don't pass on this message to the mourners. And sometimes it's almost that the mourners, my wife said to me, Shiva was so physically draining. It was grueling sitting there hour after hour listening to people and not having a break. And people should be able to have that break. And whilst on the one hand, it's a phenomenal thing for the people who are going through it to be able to express their grief and go through that grief, they also need to be given the space to still remain physical human beings and not become somebody else's sort of like, well, you're my mitzvah item now. So I need to come and need to visit you, and you need to be here because I need to come and visit you.
There needs to be a bit of understanding, and there needs to be a bit of balance on that. Clive's asked a good question. So 30 days comes from when Aaron and Moshe died. Where does 7 days of Shiva come from? So
I think the 7 days, if I remember correctly, the 7 days of Shiva come from Nadav and Avihu, where we read about them for 7 days, where the Torah tells us that you shouldn't do certain things, even though normally you would do X, Y, and Z for 7 days. In this instance, you shouldn't do it. So therefore, that tells you that it's 7 days. And so you have really, it's interesting, as you have the 7 days, you have the 30 days, you have the 11 months, you have the year. You have different stages within this grief. And it makes sense, really, that people are, in the first 7 days, are really consumed by their grief. Then in the next 30 days, they're still quite consumed, but less. And sort of we let go of this grief slowly and allow this process to take, its time. They're saying the Kaddish for 11 months. Going to the burial site at the end of the Shloshim. Some even go at the end of the Shiva. There are various things that people do, and as you go through it, each step is another stage. And like, okay, I'm taking another step away, another step away, another step away, and they're very important steps and very important, meanings and rituals in each one that give it its particular sort of sequence, so to speak.
Yeah, and without those special steps, people get a little bit lost, and I think this sort of keeps them on track almost. Kate Lurie, is it true that neshama stays around for the first 7 days around their home?
I think it's correct to say that partially. I don't know exactly what it means. You say that. I think, for example, they say that that's why the best place to sit Shiva is actually the home of the person who passed away, because neshama is there in their actual home. Whereas if you sit not in the home of the person, and I know that's not always physically possible, by the way. If somebody lived in a small 1-bedroom flat and they have 5 children and they're going to have hundreds of people coming to the Shiva house and people will be standing out the door, so that's not really, it's not always practical to do that. But on the other hand, yes, there is what to be said for what you're saying, Kate, that there is an element on the neshama that still sticks around specifically in their home.
So go back to Sarah. Sarah, if we read what happened in the Medrash in terms of people, the Satan came to her and told her that Avram had taken the boy to be slaughtered, which in truth is what was meant to have happened, or what the plan was. Did she die thinking that her son had died?
And the way the Medrash puts it, she died thinking that her son had died. She didn't get to see the full picture, and she died from the shock before realizing that it wasn't. He didn't go through with it. But again, a lot of this is it's through midrashim or conjecture within the verses, etc., etc. So it's hard to know the exact thing that happened, because there are different. There'll be different narratives explaining similar things that happen, so it's hard to be able to give one specific. See, if the Torah gives a narrative, it's much easier, but the Torah doesn't give us a narrative. The whole way this is inferred is because we read about the Akedah, and then you read right away about Sarah dying. So the inference is that they were connected. However, but that's again an inference that's made in the Mefarshim, but there's no clear narrative in the Torah, so it's hard to get a clear mandate as to say this is the story or that's the story.
And you mentioned that you, unfortunately, and I think I saw you actually, you were conducting some services today as well, yes. some burial services. That burial service that we carry out today, again, that also has it has some universal truth for every Jewish person. It doesn't matter who you are or what you were in your lifetime. We're all pretty much buried in the same sort of way. It's yes. Not the most. I mean, my grandmother back in the day always used to comment on the way that we seem to bury our dead in what she used to call a cardboard box, because it's a very plain affair compared to the way that the Gentiles do it, and it's extremely where they have very ornate caskets and so on. But each one of us is buried the same way, pretty much, that our forefathers were buried for many years. Obviously, slightly different out in the Middle East, in the middle of the desert. But it's pretty much the same for everybody, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's one of the things. Death doesn't know the difference between rich and poor. It can strike anybody. And just because somebody is a millionaire, a billionaire, trillionaire, whatever it is, sadly, money cannot buy health. Sometimes it can. Sometimes, a bit of extra money will help you to get the medical treatment that somebody with a lesser money might not be able to get. But in many instances, money won't save certain people from, from certain death. And they, as wealthy as they are, they still, I mean, you think, one of the people you can think about, there's many people you can think about, the guy from the King Power Stadium. I can't even pronounce his name. Nobody really pronounced it correctly. No? Remember
Sorry?
The Thai billionaire that owned Leicester City from the King Power Stadium.
Oh,
nobody's able to pronounce his name correctly. I could Google it. But I remember even then that I never was the first name was okay. No, that was the wrong one. Vishai, and then it's Srivat Hanaparaba. I don't know. It's one of those. I can't even get it out. It's too long.
Yeah. No, yeah. I've got it here. I will post it in the comments so people can see what we're talking about. But yeah.
Sharon here, that's your football team. Exactly. It's your football team. LCFC. So they or Kobe Bryant. Yeah. No, that's not the one. That's his son, I think. His father was called Vishai.
Even that is a mouthful.
Yeah. So, you think of Kobe Bryant, you think of this fellow, as wealthy as they were, as famous as they were, everybody dies more or less the same. And therefore, okay, we'll come back to that, Kate. That's a good question. And therefore, the people should realize that in death, and that's part of the reason they do it, in death, you have to realize that there is a certain amount that we say, he had a lot of money, and therefore, that's in death, everybody gets buried the same. You get buried in the same shrouds, you get buried in the same kind of casket, you go to the same kind of 6 feet in the ground, and it's interesting, 6 foot under, 3 feet in the ground, whatever you want to call it. But I think there's a famous story, I think they tell with a rabbi, where the 2 people came and they were arguing about a piece of land. And one said it was mine, and the other one said it was mine. And you saw the rabbi bent down to the ground and put his ear to the ground. And he said, what's going on? What are you doing, rabbi? He says, well, I just listened to the ground, and the ground says, you both think that one of you thinks the ground belongs to him, the other one thinks the ground belongs to him, and the ground says, one day both of you belong to me. Yeah, and that's what's going to be the final bottom line for anybody: wealthy, poor, popular, not popular. Healthy, unhealthy, whatever it is, that's the end of everyone. And so therefore we give everyone the same burial to say we all have the same ending. We don't want to start making it special. And there were times where, yeah, that's right. So as Ian says, it's shrouds on our pockets, and then you can't take your money with you when you die. Everyone is equal in death. There were times when they said early on that, I can't remember where this, I think the Gemara brings us, where they did have some practices where people used to spend a lot more money on doing burial practices. And then some of the poor people were so embarrassed about their lack of ability to be able to afford this, they just left their dead without burying them because it was too embarrassing for them to go through that. And then Chazal said, forget it, we're going to make it as cheap as possible. I don't know if it's as cheap as possible, but as simple as possible to be able to bury, and everybody should have the same burial. As far as the coffin is concerned, anybody who's been to Eretz Yisrael will know, and anybody who's been to a funeral in Eretz Yisrael will see that they actually bury without a coffin. In Israel, here in this country, it's illegal to bury without a coffin, so you have to bury with a coffin. But in Israel, where it's legal to bury without a coffin, so I've been to a few, you go to Har Menuchot, and they take the body and they just put it's very, very eerie. I don't know if you've ever been to it. They have like this little, where they have the gurney, where we have the gurney, they literally have like just the silhouette of the body and it's lying there. And people and they literally put the body in, and the bodies, it says that the verse says, Ki afar atav al afar tashuv, you are dust and you will go back to dust. And so therefore we actually bury in a very, it's a very, very, like you said, it's cardboard. It's not like cardboard, but it's like chip wood. It's very, very cheap wood because we want the wood to disintegrate so that the wood falls apart quickly and the body can decompose after death as part of its process of purification, etc., etc. So, it's everybody has the same, and we do that in order, and again, everybody should know that no matter who you were, we all die the same.
So we've got some comments here that we can go over. Clive Moss-Barkley, I read this as well, actually, Clive. It's a very interesting story. I read that it was the giant Og, Melech HaBoshem, right, who could see what was happening on the mountain because he was tall enough to see from afar, and he saw the blood flowing on the altar. He thought that was from Yitzchak, and that's where it's one of the interpretations of where
I can't comment one way or another.
it's one of the interpretations of where Sarah heard the news from. Phil Cohen, good evening, Phil. My concern is that the religious time frame for grief really doesn't necessarily fit with the psychological work of grieving. It's really not a one-size-fits-all. Grieving is not a linear process. Many people feel okay at the start and really need people much later. The problem is by that time they can be old news.
So the answer to that is you're absolutely right. The process is still correct in what it does. And what needs to be done many times is, I know, and I say to people that a lot of people say the Shiva is the easiest point because the Shiva, they're being propped up by all their friends and family, etc., etc. And it's only afterwards where they're not being propped up, suddenly like 2 weeks after the Shiva, where people start falling apart. And I think the job of a community and of true friends is to make sure that a few weeks after the Shiva, these people are still okay. But that doesn't mean that the process is incorrect. The process is correct in saying the most intense grief is immediately afterwards, and then et cetera, et cetera. What still needs to be done is that there needs to be a framework to make sure that people have a system of support that allows them even further down the line to be supported and not to be dropped. As he says, old news. Well, yeah, the guy died 2 months ago. Get over it. So that's not correct to say that. It's not, and different people grieve differently, where some people 2 months down the line feel much better, and some people still will not be over it and need that extra help. And yes, it needs people to go ahead and to be very proactive in the way they take care of those people that are grieving. A very good comment.
Kate Lurie has another comment, and one that we've often discussed in this house here for years already. Why are cemeteries rather unattractive in the UK? I've seen in photos that other countries have more attractive places where people would feel more comfortable visiting. It's true. So, Rabbi, where you probably grew up in Austria, and I've been to cemetery in Germany where my father-in-law is buried. The actual Jewish cemeteries over there, or at least the one that I visited, seem more like a country park than they do. I mean, there's no getting away from it. When you visit Agecroft, it's a cemetery from the minute you arrive. Even just driving up to it, it's not particularly beautiful. I think Rainsow is slightly with its hills, and it can be slightly more picturesque, but it's certainly not somewhere where you want to spend a vast amount of time. But here in this country, they've been rather Spartan, at least in this neck of the woods.
Yeah. I think of the one I've been to recently in Vienna. I don't find it, to me, a cemetery is a cemetery. Some of them are taken care of better, some of them are taken care of worse. I think there's been a tremendous amount of work that has been done by the Cemeteries Trust. And before the Cemeteries Trust came around, it was really awful. And if I think back, I was in the cemetery in Blakely. Have you been into the cemetery in Blakely, David, ever?
Yeah, I think I have.
So, you walked in and the walls were green from mold. It was just disgusting. That was really, really horrible. Whereas, some of the, at least the Cemeteries Trust took some of these cemeteries like Agecroft, like Rainsow, and gave them a bit more life, that they shouldn't look so terrible and so awful. I think a cemetery will be a cemetery, and in a way, it shouldn't really be a park. People should realize it is a cemetery. And it is what it is. That's where life ends, sadly.
Kate goes on to say that her late father's buried in the cemetery which overlooked by council estates, and why are there no trees or plants? So I think I remember from Kate not every cemetery in England's also alike. I remember Bushey Cemetery in London being a little bit better in terms of sort of quality and the look of it. But very often these were pieces of land as well that were bought on the outskirts of town. One of the oldest Jewish cemeteries in Manchester is Urmston Cemetery. And if you were to just draw a line on the map as to where that is situated, compared to where the Jews at that time were concentrated, which was
I don't know how they
around
got there.
Hightown. Sorry?
I don't know how they got there. Similar Failsworth. I have no idea how people got there.
In a horse and a cart, that would have taken you some serious time. There was no motorway, there's no direct road all the way there. So really, I don't think the Jews at the time, when we were establishing communities, had the money to buy prime pieces of land in areas of perhaps natural beauty or very close to our house. I mean, we're relatively blessed to have Agecroft and Rainsow pretty much on our doorstep over here. But not every Jewish cemetery is the same in that respect.
Oh, Ermiston takes me 20 minutes today to get to. I don't know what it must have taken in those days to get to.
It must have taken an absolute age. Right, Sharon Hood. My dear father felt this so strongly, he banned my mother from putting an announcement in the JC, social and personal. His last words, that was the measure of the man. So yeah, very, very modest man. And that is the way that we are buried. Looking later on, here we go. Anthony, what is the halacha of leaving flowers? I'm sure that I've seen flowers in Israeli cemeteries. So, of course, our tradition here is stones, and not to leave flowers.
I mean, I'd have to look up exactly why we don't leave flowers. I don't remember exactly, so I'll take a pass on that one. I'll have to come back to you that one, Anthony. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Ian. Years ago, the journey to and from Failsworth would have taken the best part of the whole day, which must have made scheduling a funeral very, very difficult. And I would imagine turnout wouldn't have been huge either. So we're blessed today in being able to drive pretty much anywhere that we need to. Clive Moss-Barkley offers another challenging question. What are we doing for people who need to sit Shiva during COVID?
That's an excellent question. I think, and we're really, we are really very, very limited in what we can do for people, depending on which stage of COVID they were in. So at certain points in time, you could go visit people, at least in their gardens. Some points in time, you were not allowed to go visit people in the gardens. So it really depends. And, again, both in the more religious sector, but even in the more traditional sector, I found there were people that didn't keep the rules exactly to the letter of the law, because they felt it was so important for them to have people around to help them with their grief in the time of Shiva that they still had people around somehow to give them to give them a bit of a boost to help them through it. So it's a good question. I think we tried the Zoom Shiva. We've done the funeral the best as we can. Sometimes if I can, we drop in a challah, but there is at the moment very little being done. Maybe it's worth a conversation, coming back to that conversation the three of us need to have, David and I and you, Clive, about the idea of this ark and what else we can provide for people who are sitting Shiva. I'm a bit of a loss of what we can do for these people other than they're having their friends calling them or visiting them or meeting up with them on Zoom and on FaceTime, and they just have to make the most of what technology gives them at the moment. And I'm not really sure what else we can do for them. But if anybody has any ideas, why not?
Rodney, the comments on flowers that maybe it is a non-Jewish custom that we just haven't carried through to our.
Anybody who does want to lay flowers, it's definitely chukas hagoy. It's definitely that. But it could be that's why they've said it. But I think they have signs around all over the place in the cemeteries. Please don't leave flowers, etc. So it must be something else. I have been to other cemeteries where I have seen flowers, so it is. Yes, it is what it is.
Okie doke. Right. So, Rabbi, I think we've been going just over an hour now. So we're not going to keep people up for much longer. Give them nightmares. I'll hand over to you to end.
All right. So let me just. I think in thinking about all the conversation that we just had, I think there are a few points to keep in mind. Is number one, to realize that none of us will live eternally, and to live our lives in a meaningful way. I often have people say to me, Rama, you spoke so beautifully at so-and-so's funeral, or so said such nice things about somebody else. And I often say to them, I said, it's not me. I'm just telling you the way I experienced that person. if you live your life in a certain way and you live your life in a very positive way, it's very easy for people to eulogize you in a very beautiful way. Some people you have to scrape the bottom of the barrel just to try to find something nice to say about them. It is really, really hard. It is really difficult. And sometimes when you don't know the people, what makes it even harder is that their children have very little to say about their parents as well. All I get to hear is that they loved word search and that they were a Mason, which is great. I'm not against that, but it's not what I want to say at a funeral. I wanted to say something more fitting, something better and bigger about them. So I think for us to understand that, live your life in the best way possible so that people remember you after 120 for what you wanted your life, what you want to be remembered for. And as far as the traditions of everything else, understand that everybody goes through the grief differently. Help people as much as you can, understand people as much as you can, and give them their space to grieve in their own way, but be there for them when they need you, not just during the week of the Shiva, maybe not just during the Shloshim. If we can be there for each other, then we can help each other in a very, very difficult time as well.
There you go. Be nice to people. It is later than you think. You never know when it's going to come around. Okay, to all of you, have a great week. And Clive will be in touch about building this. We have been making some progress behind the scenes. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next week. Rabbi, thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
See you soon.
Bye.